It's great to be here in Portugal and on this time zone. I just want to thank Henry and Scott for the opportunity to participate, to collaborate on this panel. When we first discussed what should be the topic, we said let's focus in on disruptive innovation because there's so many startup founders in the audience here that are trying to bring novel, new technologies to the market, and it's a tough path. So let's go bring some of the rock star innovators that have the battle scars to prove it. And so before we jump in, though, I just wanted to say that Veranex is very proud to sponsor this event and to participate with LSI on thought leadership and panels. But if you're not familiar with Veranex, I just want to say very quickly that we are a full-service medtech-only innovation solutions firm. So in a nutshell, we can take a concept or an idea for a product all the way through product development, preclinical, clinical, regulatory, market access, you name it, to a cleared product and beyond. And this topic today is a particularly one that's near and dear to my heart. It's a sweet spot for Veranex, and that's in new, novel, disruptive innovation. So I am going to run through quickly the bios of these amazing panelists. If I did the full bios, I'd be here for the full 40 minutes. They're that accomplished. You know Todd Brinton because you probably caught his keynote this morning. He's the Chief Scientific Officer and Corporate Vice President at Edwards Lifesciences. He's recently been in the news as co-founder of Shockwave, and of course, their record-breaking exit. He's an interventional cardiologist served at Stanford University Medical Center, Palo Alto VA Medical Center, and also served as the fellowship director at Stanford Musalem Center for Biodesign. And also we have Chris Carlson, Executive Vice President of Research, Corporate Development, and Ventures. Chris is responsible for identifying, evaluating, and developing new technologies, clinical indications, platforms, and new business opportunities for Intuitive. Andrew Cleeland, he's one of the troublemakers in this group. He's the CEO of Fogarty Innovation. He has an extensive background in successful exits, Ardian and 12, to name a couple. He also serves as an advisor to Longitude Capital and Arboretum Ventures. And we have Howard Levin at the end there, saving the best for last, CEO and Chief Medical Officer at Deerfield Catalyst. He's a heart failure transplant cardiologist and a leading expert in creating novel therapies for cardiac, respiratory, neuro, and renal patients.
And the troublemaker.
So, all right, so we want to tackle what are the key success factors for enabling disruptive innovation. So we thought we'd start off right here with Todd and talking about how do you define disruptive innovation and the importance of a mission-driven mantra.
Yeah, so we obviously had the opportunity to talk a little bit before putting this panel together, and I think we all universally kind of agreed on the idea, but medtech's hard. It's really hard. I think if you're interested in making big dollars and stuff, go to tech. It's easier, and that's hard too. But I think the big thing that differentiates medtech from tech is the mission, the opportunity to have a real significant impact. And I said this morning, do something that matters, that you can feel really proud of when you go to bed at night. That really is what ultimately is a big part of creating disruptive technologies, is really being willing to take the risk. And because it's so hard and because it takes so long, there's so many bumps along the road. If you're not mission driven about doing something that really matters, you're gonna run out of steam. You often, even in the most successful ventures, typically will have a number of moments where ultimately you think the thing's going to blow up. You have no chance of going forward, and so you have to have that passion, that hunger to want to push it forward. The The market's disruptive. What's disruptive? I think it's, two axes, basically the size of the opportunity and the impact of the opportunity. People can often think, well, it's too small of a market. I had this debate with two people earlier today. It's not the size that defines it. It's also the impact you can have. You can have a big impact on a very narrow indication. That's very disruptive to the space. And I think that people think often that the only thing that investors care about is big, meaning lots of patients. I completely disagree. There's lots of advantages to being narrow, lots of indications as far as distribution and access and KOLs. So don't get caught up in that whole thing. Believe in the impact that you can have ultimately on patients. And I think that's where the mission comes from.
Andrew, you spoke to very eloquently on why you would choose disruptive innovation. Do you want to versus iterative? Do you want to speak to that?
Before I do, I just want to say, I just want to thank Josh and Todd. That keynote this morning was, I've been doing this a long, long time. Yeah. That was really inspirational. So well done, guys.
Yeah.
Thank you.
And thank you for doing that.
Thank you.
I think you've quoted me of saying, why not go big? And I think the real thing is, one of my mentors told me a long time ago, it is in medtech, it is just as hard to do the small as it is to do the big, to do the ones that have the impact to the ones that have less impact. So given what Todd just said about being mission driven, having impact really does matter. It matters because it is something that will not only drive you, it will drive your team.
Yeah.
I think that when we're looking at what makes a company successful, I think there are two things. It's being well capitalized and it's having a great team. Both of those things are heavily influenced by impact. It's easier to raise large amounts of money if you can have impact, and it is much more easier to hire a committed team if you're doing something that has meaning or has value.
Yeah. Chris, you were talking about for big disruptive innovation, you need to better understand, you need to evaluate the market, and you were talking about knowing the long-term model. Do you want to speak more to that?
Sure. Yeah, I think that maybe is just a follow-on to what we were listening to earlier, which is I think about opportunities as, are you doing something that's noticeably different? Okay. Is it better than the alternatives? And is it hard to copy? And if you can have those three things, you've got some sense of what the value you can create in the future might look like. Now the question is how does that value get distributed? One thing to think about if you haven't spent a lot of time in a company before is that value has to flow through the company, right? So your sales and marketing team take some of that, your R&D team, especially in the early days, take a big portion of that, et cetera. And ultimately some of that has to flow to shareholders. And so just as you're sizing these things up, it's maybe just one double click to what we were talking about earlier. If you can pay attention to that and there's plenty left over for the equity holders and there's plenty left over for the employees, then you've got something worth pursuing, which is exciting.
And Howard, you were talking about, you're at the bleeding edge of early innovation. And sometimes at that early stage, big disruption can be sometimes seen as unfundable. And it doesn't happen overnight, maybe. Do you want to speak more to that?
Yeah, no, I can confirm it's unfundable. No, it's like what everybody has said on the panel. You want to go for something that's got a huge impact, that'll make a big difference, because that's what, if you're going to do something disruptive, either by definition it's going to be, be impactful, but really you should make sure it's going to make a big difference in what's the therapies that are currently available, because you're going to have to grind it out because there's nothing usually that's a roadmap for you to follow for that specific thing. But as Andrew said, it's just as hard to do something big as something small a lot of times, and you shouldn't let it stop you.
I would just add, Lisa, I think just to make a connection between what Andrew said and Howard said, I think in some ways the harder it is sometimes to raise capital in the early days, the more prognostic that you're doing to something disruptive. Andrew said that you need a lot of capital. That's true, but it doesn't necessarily mean that it's easy to get that capital in the early stages. I think you absolutely need a lot of, the more disruptive it is once you establish yourself. But often the idea, and I don't think there's that many that are as talented as Howard at going early. I don't think anything you do isn't disruptive, frankly, Howard. I mean, you're usually trying to discover new physiology, trying ultimately to kind of come up with new solutions. That stuff most people run from early because no one's done it before. There's nothing to follow. And often people like to follow, a good section of investors follow what's worked for others in the past. Some investors, I think great investors, have a strategy themselves that they're willing to take risk and they're willing to believe in a team to do something totally different. But those are hard to find. And so I think if you're an entrepreneur out there who's saying, I really think I have something important that I'm really doing, and you're finding it difficult to raise capital, you're probably in the right place. So if you answering the question of it's really hard to raise money, I shouldn't do this, that should not be prognostically the decision for you of it can't be done. The more you're disrupting the system, the more you're doing something different, I think the harder it is early. Then once you get some momentum and get some impact and you start to see things, you're going to need a lot of capital to get there. Once you show that path, I absolutely agree with Andrew.
Where's that point? Where do you think that point is?
Yeah, you got to get to feasibility.
Yeah, you got to get to clinical.
You got to get to feasibility, and a lot of times it's clinical. Sometimes it's not clinical. Sometimes there's a way to get rarely bench, but some in vivo animal feasibility. But those are rare. Mostly it's clinical feasibility. But it doesn't mean you have to treat 1,000 patients to get there. But that's usually where the inflection point is. And you have to find a way to push your way through it. And I talked to several people this morning. They're like, it's just a struggle to raise money. I'm like, yep, it always has been. It always will be, and it's worth doing.
This morning you were talking about Shockwave and your experience in early fundraising. Do you want to, for those that missed it, do you want to talk about that experience and what the inflection point was?
Yeah, I mean, just to take it, we couldn't raise money at all. I mean, there was just no way to raise money. Now, it was a difficult time. It was actually 2008, 2009. The market was obviously recovering and not unlike kind of where things are now in the capital markets. It was probably worse, but we probably went to 30 venture groups, had multiple meetings, but no one was interested at that point in time just because the timing of the investment cycle, people were holding onto their capital for their existing investments. And if I had evaluated that as that we had a terrible idea, we couldn't get it funded, which is what we absolutely did, but I look back in time now and think that's why I'm saying it has nothing necessarily to do with the idea or disruptive, it's just where things are in the markets. And so I think, I used to say this a lot, which is if you don't believe in it, nobody else will. And so you have to be the believer. If you're looking for external validation, you're in the wrong business. You have to believe yourself.
But can I just follow on what Todd said? So, just like there is difference in the markets, there's difference in VCs, right? So,
Very much so.
You can go to 10 VCs, and we went to 10 VCs, and 9 of them say this is the stupidest thing I've seen, and one of them really loves it, or it depends where they are in their cycle. Did they just raise a fund? Are they willing to do an early investment? Are they later in the fund, et cetera? But even though I say this somewhat jokingly, I actually truly mean it. When you start pitching, go to the people who, the first 2 or 3 who absolutely are not going to fund you and that will take great pleasure in torturing you and asking you all the questions that because you will get to the point where at the end of those 2 or 3, you start hearing the same things and you've are prepared to answer questions about all the things you're going to be asked, and it really puts you in a better place.
I think that's so against what people think the conventional wisdom is, which is go out to the ones you think you're going to get the best response from, and I couldn't agree more with you. Totally. You learn.
You're a
through
troublemaker.
You learn. No, I'm agreeing with you.
Oh, you're agreeing with me.
For once,
he's not a troublemaker.
For once, I'm agreeing with you. That I think that's really important, that you are learning how to pitch. You're learning a story, and the only way to do that is off folks who are going to critique it.
Yeah.
But then
Chris, you want to talk about blind spots? Founders' blind spots?
Blind spots? Yeah, sure. I guess the mental model for, an innovator in this space, I'm trying to dovetail it into fundraising, but it's it's keeping this open mind. So on on the one hand, you want to maintain your focus, right? You've got your mission. I think that's super important. You have the questions you're trying to solve. I find very often the most interesting things are the questions you didn't know you were trying to solve or that you weren't aware yet that you were going to have to solve. And that's where I think prototyping or debugging everything. So it could be your technology, it could be your feasibility, it could be in your preclinical labs or comparative labs, et cetera. But it can apply to fundraising or even recruiting the best talent. So the expectation for me almost always is that the test I'm going to run is not going to work. I'm deliberately trying to design tests that both show something will work, but also show at the limits where it doesn't work. And it's those surprises that ultimately lead to the insights that I think that ultimately lead to the requirements and the products that I'm the most proud of. Yeah.
Yeah. You know, Howard, you also talk about in disruptive innovation the disposition that you need to have, getting comfortable.
Yeah, you need to be genetically deranged, number one. And then number two, you have to be comfortable with being uncomfortable. I mean, I can't think of a better way. It sounds stupid, but I can't think of a better way to say it. I'm sure somebody can, but you know, it's really, really hard, and you have to be ready. You can't wait for 100% of the information to make a decision.
Yeah.
You know,
Couldn't agree more. I think another way of saying the same thing is, we call it humble self-confidence. Be humble enough to know that you don't know the answers, right? But be self-confident enough to know that you're going to find one.
It's not failing, because everybody's going to fail at some point, and there's nothing wrong with that. It's how you respond to that failure. And, you know, and we had this discussion earlier, you know, how do you know when to stop? And there is no really good, it's great to kill things early if you can't, you know, if it clearly is not going to work, but you'd rather, you know, if you can and you really believe in it, you truly believe in it, you want to go, push, but then you get to a point where, should I pivot this way, should I pivot that way? And I think these guys have a lot of experience in knowing, you know, choosing when to pivot.
Todd, you're the master pivoter. It's on your wall, right?
Yeah. Well, just one thing to before I talk about pivoting, we have a term that I used to say it when I was teaching at Stanford, which is you got to get comfortable with living in the gray. The world is not black and white. Innovation is not black and white. And every day, and you got to take a lot of pride. And I think everyone in this room should take a lot of pride in what we do. We make impact in people's lives. You know, through the investments you make, through the development you make, whether you're a service provider, whether you're an entrepreneur, these are really important things. But the ability to have an impact is what differentiates us from what other people do for a living. That being said, you need to know when to pivot. And often the answer of when is usually in retrospect, right? And so you look back and go, well, that was the right decision, I decided to shift. You have to constantly be asking yourself, with the data you have coming in, is it time to adjust, not just to try and pound something up the hill. I used to say, you know, taking a big rock up the hill, eventually you get crushed. Right? And so eventually you got to be able to adjust what you're doing to a different market, an assumption you made that was incorrect, and it goes back to something that he was saying, which is, I think at the end of the day, everything you do should be about trying to get your project to fail. And I think we have this interpretation that failure means bad. I will tell you that I think failure is good. And what I mean is test failure, project failure, very good. They are not associated with career failure. Everyone thinks failure they're associated with, that means career failure, not doing well. Fail the test, fail the project, move on your resources to something else or to a different angle or a different perspective. That's how you keep, that's what great teams do. And I believe now that I do investing, and I invest now strategically and outside, that you invest in the team, you invest in their ability to adjust to new information. No one starts and goes, I've got the killer app, it's perfect, I just need a team to build it. It's not going to be what you think it's going to be. You're going to run into something along the way, which means you have to be able to pivot. And the teams that recognize that are the teams you really recognize are really strong and capable of taking things forward, whether individuals or their groups.
I think the ability to pivot comes I mean, it's so important, right? That pivot is not necessarily a negative, that something's not working, pivot. It is based on learning.
Opportunistic, yeah.
It's learning, so that over the, where you start to, as the company develops, you're going to be learning. And you may find that the technology isn't working as well as you want, so that leads to a type of a pivot. You also might learn that the market might be a little different than you anticipated. That leads to a different type of pivot. And I think one of the things that we've all learned, and it's I think a maxim at BioDesign, which is don't fall in love with your technology, solve the problem. Right? And that might mean that you've learned that the technology that you sort of nurtured along isn't the right way to solve the problem. That's a pivot. We had a classic pivot at Ardian. So I hope most of you know that Ardian came originally from this gentleman and the gentleman sitting in the front row there. Had a concept, and there was a brilliant concept, which was to disrupt the sympathetic nervous system to treat a sympathetically mediated disease, which was heart failure. So I think, it was tough to get that funded in the early years, right?
It was brutal, yeah.
One of the things that unlocked the potential of that was changing from an implant technology to a catheter-based technology. All of a sudden, we're now moving from leaving a piece of hardware in somebody to handing this procedure over to someone like Todd, one of these aggressive, reckless types, or what we would call rapid adopters. That was a huge pivot, and we made a subsequent one later on when we were focusing originally on heart failure, which is a significant problem with major impact. But we realized another sympathetically mediated disease is hypertension. And, it's 1 in 3 adults in the Western world has hypertension. So the market potential was vast. And it was a much easier disease state to measure. Measure blood pressure versus that. And so again, I think being able to recognize that what we were looking at, what we were learning along the way, forced us actually to take a different path.
But you didn't pivot because the market numbers were bigger. You pivoted because the opportunity to have an outcome that was meaningful
was more easily
was
measurable.
easier to get
Right.
to a target.
Yep,
And
easily
people will
measurable.
make the confusion and say, oh, it's bigger, so investors will care more. That wasn't the reason for the pivot. It was that you had something very objective that you could hit that wasn't going to be hospitalizations and take longer to get to.
Correct.
I wanted to touch on something that the three of you have all said, and I think the panel illustrates in different ways. So Mark and I are really good at doing early stage, physiology type stuff. And, we can get it through the first 20, 30 patients. Have we taken things further? Yeah. But I think as a founder, what you have to realize is that, or as a employee of a company or leader of a company, you're good for what you're good at. And really, we know what we do best. And then, over time we figured out it was then time to step back and let people who were better skill set for the particular phase, like Andrew took over Ardian, and his skill set was, just honestly a lot better than ours for the time that, the things that he did. Do you then need somebody more commercial to sell? There's different skills and different things. It doesn't mean you can't stay with the company. Doesn't mean you can't contribute to the company if you're passionate about it and that's what you want to do. But you have to contribute in your role and not inhibit people from making, be a quote-unquote bad founder for whatever it counts.
It's a huge factor. It's probably the number one factor I think that people get really too locked up on, was if I'm the founder and the CEO, I have to be the CEO forever. And I can tell you that that's just not realistic. You don't have the capabilities, the skills, or the experience usually to do that. And so you can still contribute. I was never the CEO of Shockwave. I was the CMO. I was still in practice. I spent a huge amount of time there. I did so. But the idea that I needed to be the CEO or that somebody else needed to be the CEO specifically, we went through multiple CEOs along the way, ultimately to Doug Godshall, who actually exited to the J&J. And Doug made one of the biggest impacts in the company as someone who is proven. He'd taken a company public before. He knew how to scale the business. He was absolutely the right choice at the right time. So I think one of the biggest challenges we all run into is this idea, and you said earlier about this humility, is that knowing what you know how to do best and being proud of that, and not thinking that you necessarily need to do it all, because it takes a lot of people to get technology across the line to have a big impact on patients. And often we think, well, I'm the only one that can do it. And if that's the way you're feeling, I think your path is going to be really, really difficult to get through.
And end in tragedy.
Yeah. No, I mean, I haven't seen one, if someone had that mentality, that's ever been successful.
Agree.
Yeah.
Chris, do you want to cover team? You work with a lot of startups, and you have what's your strategy on building out the team for startups?
I guess the themes I've seen is that maybe non-intuitively, early on, you want some of the most experienced and possibly most expensive employees in general. You can have a few people earlier in their career, and even if you're a young founder, you might be earlier in your career. But finding these individuals that are experienced in medtech, right? So we've got the technology, regulatory, you've got the physician, the payer, the provider. It's a very complex industry. And so I think paying up and actively recruiting, getting through probably some painful no's in the process to get those experienced people on board is super valuable. And then I think another trend is in the early days, it tends to be very clinically and technology oriented. There'll be a reimbursement strategy, et cetera. And then there'll be this crucial moment where you need to think about going to market. And that is one big area where I think the company tends to pivot. It tends to take a more commercial mindset, and it tends to have a very significantly different set of skills. And so again, recruiting from the outside, someone who's really good in med tech commercial can really pay off. So I agree with that 100%.
We have time, and we talk, and then we loop back to pivoting, and then we talk, and then we loop back to pivoting. And Todd, you told me that you have up on your wall, pivoting is the key to success. Do you have any battle scars that you want to, or stories about pivoting you want to share? We have time for everyone to share a pivot story.
I think the best example I've heard that Andrew articulated was Ardian. I think there was some real fundamental adjustments that were really smart, that were data-based. They were based on the data you're getting in the lab and the outcome and other things. I think that the best example I can give you that I can think of offhand was pivoting the team, what you were just saying, which is, the team has to evolve over time. And everyone has a part to play in that. And so there was a time that we needed to make an adjustment in the team. And those adjustments sometimes are difficult, but it's about getting ultimately the therapy to patients. And I remember going to a conference, 15 years ago and hearing John Simpson, who I think is one of the most incredible innovators, say that at the end of the day, it's honestly about patients. And I was like, yeah, that guy's made a lot of money. He's been very successful. Is that really true? And I've gotten to know John over the years. That is absolutely his motivation. He literally wants to disrupt, and have a very, very big impact on patients. And I think that if you stay focused on that, it's not just because it's the cool thing to say or the right thing to say. It really makes a difference. Because if you do that well, all the other things will follow. And this is really hard to do. Stay focused on that. That's the biggest take home I can have, because if you're worried about not making the adjustments you need to make in the leadership of the team, or the going and get the best talent you need, or the market assessment you don't do those things, then you never ultimately get to patients, and that's ultimately where the reward is.
You've said something so important there, right? That if you're a founder and you fail that test, and that test being that you are more interested in getting your solution to patients than to making money or getting status or something like that. If you genuinely can't answer that question positively, you're going to struggle when things get tough a little bit later on. Yeah. It's a real question you've got to ask. Yeah. Why am I doing this?
Another question that I'm just throwing it out here because I realize it's a question I've been dying to ask you, Chris, but you've added another $150 million so on on this year to your venture fund.
Yep.
How does disruptive innovation play in your investment thesis with the funds that you've now just added on?
I think investment and building are two sides of the same coin. And so again, you're looking for big impact, which is something like, the clinical impact times the total number of patients you can serve. So yeah, we're looking to serve patients in an impactful way. And if you can do that in a way that's hard to copy, if you're creating value, it kind of works out in the end. So that tends to be where we're geared as well.
Yeah.
We got to get them. We need to get them to open that wallet up.
Yeah.
You need to get out there.
Well, yes, Muriel's here. The wallet's open. I did want to say that we've talked a lot about pivoting. I think there's something about, maybe it's because perseverance is taken for granted.
Yeah.
So I was just thinking, I spent the early part of my career at Intuitive on the ION program, and I was like, oh, it wasn't that bad. And then I was kind of thinking back, and I was like, no, I just kind of forgot. Like the first 100 physicians, no joke, 100, I'd have them sign the NDA and I'd show them what I was working on. I had preclinical labs and models set up. And I think every single one said I was crazy. I mean, really. I mean, me and the team collectively, I was at Intuitive, right? Had a name brand, had built some stuff and had a demo, and they were like, this will never, ever work. And I was talking to reimbursement consultants, and they're like, this is a diagnostic. It will never support the cost of a robot. It will never work. And we actually also had a pre-sub with the FDA, and we explained, hey, we're going to do the exact same testing process that the predicate took. And the FDA was like, that will never work. Like we will not clear the device if you do that testing because it's clear it will never work. And again, the opportunity that presented itself in every one of those interactions was, well, why do you think so? Like, what could I show you that would change your mind? And that series of hundreds of interactions led to, how we designed our clinical study, which we did in market, which was optional, but we did it. How we did our marketing literature, how we raised money from the board, how we recruited all of our KOLs, et cetera. And so anyhow, so that, sort of pain or rejection or essentially a mountain of no's turned into a really wonderful set of requirements that holds to this day. So I would say, yeah, pivoting, we had some pivots along the way, but at the end it was the perseverance to the patient at the end of the line that made the difference.
Todd, I think you gave a master class this morning on perseverance also, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think I said before, if you don't believe, nobody else will. And it's not believe unrealistically, but fundamentally, and again, it's not about believing in the technology. I think it's about believing in the need. Fundamentally believing there's an opportunity and there's some value creation opportunity. Because sometimes everyone focuses on the tech. And I think that it's really about what you're trying to solve and what ultimately the value in solving that problem can be. And ultimately, simple solutions sometimes are the most eloquent. It doesn't have to be a highly sophisticated solution. It's just enough to solve the fundamental problem. And sometimes I think we over-invent, we over-create, and think that that's somehow going to move the market in a certain direction. I mean, one of the best examples and the biggest growth companies out there is Intuitive, right? And what they continue to do is they continue to innovate. They continue to move the bar. It's not a company that just levels out and goes, hey, we got a cool robot. They are continuing to push the limit of innovation. So whether you're in a big strategic that's a big growth company like Intuitive, or you're an entrepreneur out there, the whole goal is to move the goalposts, constantly trying to innovate better. And the only way you're going to get there is that you have to be, the most difficult thing to do is convince yourself first. Many times people would say, I want to convince someone. I said, well, I used to say, take out your credit card. If you believe enough that you're willing to put your own money and your own future in it, if you don't, then why would you expect somebody else to put their money into it? It's a tough thing to do because it's really about putting your chips in the center of the table. But ultimately, I think that's what the test, as you said, that ultimately is you're willing to put your livelihood there. We call it in the Valley strapped to the rocket. Ultimately, that's the definition, I think, of being an innovator.
I think between the two of you just then, I've always had this issue. We coach a lot of companies, right? That's what we do now. The issue around perseverance. Perseverance, there's also the definition of insanity, doing the same thing time and time again, right? you actually just solved this for me, because it is a struggle to tell these young companies. Believe that the solution warrants an answer, right? So believe that, that the problem warrants a solution is what I meant. So, and the second one is to take those no's as a way of continuing to learn, right? So you're not just going back and hitting the wall again, you're learning. And so it's a combination of those two things, which is really perseverance, right? It's not being static. It's not just, hammering ahead. It is believing, as you just said, in yourself and what you're trying to accomplish, and learning and adapting.
Yeah, great point.
We have just a few minutes left, and there's startup CEOs in the audience that may be wondering if they're somewhat deranged and or insane or a bit of both.
You're among company.
You're among good company, yeah. So, and I'm just wondering if we want to just go down through and give some words of wisdom, or maybe some things that you wished, like Chris, that someone who would have told you 20 years plus ago. As an early innovator of just bringing about disruptive innovation. Who wants to go first?
I'll start just to make it easier to go down the
elder
road.
statesman.
The elder is the important question, right? So the one thing that actually I had heard from Todd today that stuck out to me was, perseverance is good, and you really need to push it through. You may fail, actually the company may even fail, because you're in heart failure and SGLT2 inhibitors came and it took away your market, or whatever it is, make up something. That doesn't mean you as a person have failed. And you can go and do the next one, and you can go and do the next one. The key is, if you want to innovate and you want to do something, never give up. The company may fail, but again, it doesn't mean that you personally failed. If there was a reason, you have to assess it and understand your contribution to it, but you should never quit.
Yes, that was a good one. I don't know where to go after that. I would say, I was so fortunate early on to have good mentors, good people around. So it is find those folks. I got to spend time with this guy early on. I think that learning from others is the way to accelerate your learning, right? And that's, I'll leave it at that. Find your mentors.
I think that's great. Early in my career, my mentor was Rob Young, and he told me that the companies come and go, but the people stay the same. And like circling back to the earlier comment, build healthy relationships with, the most badass people you can find, and you may get a chance to swing the bat with them again and again and again. So it's definitely a long game. So have fun and build relationships as you go.
No, that's a good point. I think that some of the most successful projects I've ever seen were people who had lots of failures before they had success. And I think you learn the most from the failures you have. I don't believe you learn from success. I know that seems a little kooky, but I really don't. I think failure, project failure, a test failure, ultimately, it's uncomfortable. It doesn't feel good. That's when you should pay attention. It's the no. Why did it work? What did I learn from it? How did I experience that? And not confusing that for career failure, that you personally are somehow, there's a defect, you're not doing well. Because being an entrepreneur is really hard. You're often alone, you're often in a world, or you're in a small team. And so I think, I've thought about that a lot for myself, but I use that now when I think about building teams. I often will say to people, not just the classic, what has been your failure, all this stuff during interviews, but often people that have failed, they've learned from those things when they've failed. And ultimately, that's been the whole point to their ability to learn from that, turn it around, and be successful. And so you want to put together a team of people that ultimately have a collective experience the best you can. Surround yourself with people a lot smarter than you, a lot more talented than you, and ultimately you have your best chance of getting a success. And again, success is about getting to the patient.
I want to follow up on something Chris said. I think it's super important. And this is really key, I think, to folks who are running companies for the first time. You've got to build enduring relationships, not transactional relationships. And it becomes very clear very quickly when I get to deal with folks who want something from me, which is all the time. And if this is going to be transactional, I have zero tolerance anymore. And what I've noticed, and I think, look, we've known each other for a long, long time, and we've built up relationships where there is meaning and substance. And that substance then comes back, right? Who knew you were going to be running Edwards in a couple of years? Yeah, we'll be able to sell you companies because of the relationships we've done.
Well, let's see. I'm going to summarize really quickly. I think we've taken we've gotten some great insights. I would say that, Howard, your comment about getting comfortable with being uncomfortable, be prepared to pivot, lean into your blind spots, failure is good, and seek out mentors and people with battle scars like these esteemed panelists. So thank you so much. Let's give a warm round of applause to these folks.